We've got another weather front bringing increasing cloud and maybe a little rain to the north coast of Northern Ireland and the west coast of Scotland by morning. Bit of drizzle in the southwest, the odd shower elsewhere, but for most it's a dry night. Clearer spells across the heart of the country will allow it to turn quite chilly. The coldest conditions in northern Scotland, where a frost is again likely. Elsewhere will be down into single digits. So a chilly start to Thursday, but we should see some brighter skies compared to today over North Wales and northern England, at least for a time, but generally clouding over again. Wet weather across Scotland with snow on the hills, although the central belt will probably turn drier later. And then this next weather system I talked about earlier, spreading some outbreaks of rain into parts of England and Wales. A little bit milder, but obviously it won't feel all that mild with the rain and the increasing winds. And we'll see that rain becoming more extensive through the evening. Some uncertainty about how far north it gets and how heavy it is, but many places likely to see some rain during Thursday night and as we head into Friday. You can see here actually a swirl. It's an area of low pressure that's going to edge away during Friday and take the rain with it. So yes, a damp start for many, but certainly in the west likely to brighten up on Friday with some sunny spells. Eastern areas may stay a bit glum, but it will generally turn dry. Still pretty cold in northern Scotland, but elsewhere temperatures just on the rise. And look at this in the south, 16, 17, 18, maybe even a little higher, where we see some lengthy spells of sunshine. A mixed bag into the weekend, drier on Saturday.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening, it's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. I'm literally hot foot from the House of Commons. I was brought here by a fantastic London cab driver called Mick, who got me here in record time because we've been debating the government's illegal migration bill. I'll be bringing you the latest insight from Westminster, along with what this bill means for tackling the migrant crisis. Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick has come under fire over his comments about integration, and like the loyal backbencher that I am, I will be defending him. The Bank of England strikes again in its latest blame game faux pas, to use a French term. One of its chief economists has stated Britons need to accept they are poorer. But doesn't the bank need to accept that it's its responsibility? And it seems my old department took its laissez-faire approach too far by effectively writing off almost £1 billion of taxpayers' money sent in error through the pandemic scheme. Former Treasury Minister, the Lord Agnew, who resigned after strongly criticising the government's response to the scandal, will join me later. State of the Nation starts now. We're also blessed by a particularly trenchant panel this evening. The pugnacious former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the mighty founder of the socialist Novara Media, Aaron Bastani. As ever, I want to hear from you. As you know, it's a crucial part of the show. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.uk. But now it's time for your multivitamins with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Our top story on GB News tonight. More than 300 people with British passports have boarded evacuation flights escaping the violence in Sudan in northeast Africa, with the first group arriving back in the UK today. At least 4 RAF planes have taken off from the capital Khartoum, taking Britons to Cyprus. 8 flights are planned for today. A 72-hour ceasefire between the Sudanese military and rival paramilitary forces is still holding, but it's due to run out at midday tomorrow. The Prime Minister says British forces are racing now to rescue as many people as possible before it ends. Families with children, the elderly and those with medical conditions will be given priority. One man arriving back at Stansted today thanked British troops for bringing him home.
Absolutely fantastic to be back. It's been a nightmare. I've never seen anything like this before. We saw it on television before. We never thought it was going to happen to a peaceful country like Sudan. The Khartoum is just like a ghost city. Everybody's leaving Khartoum now. Ever so grateful to the British servicemen and women who risked their lives to come to Sudan and help us out.
Well, the Home Secretary says there are no plans to introduce safe routes for Sudanese people who want to seek asylum in the UK. Suella Braverman insisted the government's priority is rescuing British people.
We have no plans to do that. Our focus, first and foremost, right now, and bearing in mind this is a fast-moving situation and a complex situation, is to support British nationals and their dependents.
Now, the British MP Andrew Bridgen has told GB News he's very disappointed that the Conservative Party has chosen to leak details of his expulsion. He was expelled from the party on the 12th of April on the recommendation of a disciplinary panel. And that's after he questioned the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines in a retweeted comparison of the government's rollout to the Holocaust. Clinical trials have shown COVID vaccines are safe and effective. Mr Bridgen said he'll stand again at the next election. The government's saying today it has met a 2019 manifesto pledge to recruit 20,000 new police officers in England and Wales. The Metropolitan Police is the only force in the country not to have reached its own individual target, admitting they're 1,000 officers short. The ongoing recruitment programme is expected to cost £18.5 billion over the next decade. Both the Police Federation and the Labour Party say there are fewer police officers per head of population now than there were in 2010. And the King and Queen Consort have unveiled the stage set for the Eurovision Song Contest. The royals turned on the lights at the Liverpool Arena before being given a behind-the-scenes tour. Charles told the UK's entry performer May Muller he'd be egging her on. The competition will take place a week after his coronation. The UK was chosen to host the contest on behalf of Ukraine. That's all from me. I'm back in an hour. See you then.
Yesterday, the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, came under fire for saying excessive uncontrolled migration threatens to cannibalise the compassion that marks out the British people. He went on to say, and those crossing tend to have completely different lifestyles and values to those in the UK and tend to settle in already hyper-diverse areas, undermining the cultural cohesiveness that binds diverse groups together and makes our proud multi-ethnic democracy so successful. These remarks inevitably were attacked by the politically correct brigade as being straight from the far right's playbook. But it's a fair point for Mr. Jenrick to raise. Britain is a compassionate country, and we want to welcome people who will help the country. Allowing unchecked migration poses a risk to cohesion and also, of course, to democratic control. And that's what today in the House of Commons was about. As I said, I've literally just got here straight from the Commons, where we've been voting to put through the illegal migration bill to try and stop the small boats coming, to ensure that the European Convention on Human Rights, as interpreted by the European Court, can't stop the democratic control that the British people want and need. We've got to move away from a system where anyone who gets here will be put up in an hotel across the country so that tourist resorts are being used not for people to go and have a nice time, but as holding places for people who have come here unlawfully, illegally. We need to make sure that the people who come to this country have a right to be here and that there is a deterrent to stop those coming illegally in small boats. And how are we going to do that? Because you will say the Conservatives have been in government for 13 years. Why hasn't it happened yet? And the truth is we've been bound in by the EU and then by the European Court. This piece of legislation finds a route through that and ought to make it possible to ensure that people are sent back to safe places, whether they be where they've come from immediately, such as France, or to places like Rwanda, where they will be able to apply for asylum. Now, I've got two people with me to discuss this who know more about it than almost anybody else in the country. Your own, GB News' own Nigel Farage, and Ben Habib, formerly of the Brexit Party, who's kindly joined us as well. Ben, do you think this has finally unlocked it? Are we really now serious? Or is it going to be another well-intentioned effort that doesn't deliver?
Well, can I say, before answering your question, what a pleasure it is to be here, Jacob, with you and Nigel, two great political free thinkers. And I'm not sure I know any more about this subject than either Nigel or you, but I will venture an opinion. I think the government's got it back to front, if you don't mind me saying so. Deportation, which is at the centre of this deterrence policy, is what you need when border control has failed. And there is no deportation policy or set of regulations or laws that I think can make up for a failure in border control in the first place. And it's almost like trying to pour water out of a sinking ship. You know, you just can't get it out fast enough. So we first had the Nationality and Borders Bill, and we were told that that would sort the problem out. We then had the Rwandan policy to deport people seamlessly to Rwanda. We've yet to see anyone go there. And we now got the illegal migration bill. And when you read the illegal migration bill, it starts off incredibly well, very strongly for those people on my side of the debate. You know, the Secretary of State is required to detain and then deport people who've entered the country illegally. Fantastic. But as you go through it, you realise it's been got to by people on the more liberal side, perhaps, of the Conservative Party, who, when once you get to Section 51, you see there's a carve-out, actually, for the European Court of Human Rights, and giving it the right to giving the Secretary of State the right to fall into line with ECHR rulings. And that's, if you like, a coach and horses through what would otherwise be quite a good bill. What I would have liked to have seen was language to the effect of, notwithstanding any rulings from the this is what our policy on deportation is going to be.
Nigel, isn't this the final test for our membership of the European Convention. That if, in spite of everything, the European Court still blocks us from getting rid of people who've come here illegally, then the pressure to leave the Convention will be overwhelming.
I think, interestingly, it won't actually be the court in Strasbourg that stops this working. It'll be British judges. It'll be British judges using the ECHR, which, of course, has been incorporated into British law via the Human Rights Act. Now, yeah, you know, I know that in some ways, British Bill of Rights, what's been voted on just within the last hour, in some ways you can say the law's been updated. But all the while we're signatories to an international treaty, 9 out of 10 of our judges will always rule in favour of that treaty. So I think we've got a problem with our own judiciary. I think the real truth of it is this. I mean, the Conservative Party have failed completely on this issue. We've had promise after promise, as Ben mentioned before. Every time there's a new Rwanda, you know, Boris announces Rwanda, the Daily Mail go, hooray, it's all solved. The optimism of people is amazing. It's been catastrophic. I mean, you know, and we haven't even touched on the levels of legal migration into Britain that are now hitting all-time records. Separate debate. But I actually think this. I think that the legislation, and it reads brilliantly to begin with, is in conflict with our international obligations. And therefore, logically, what we have to do is to reconsider and change our international obligations. And we ought to do it properly. We ought to do it the nice way. Tony Abbott in Australia was so frustrated in the end that he said, to hell with the UN, to hell with what the EU are going to say and everybody else, and simply deported people, towed them straight back to Indonesia and ended the problem. I think this question of sovereignty of our borders is why we won the referendum in 2016. It was the key deciding factor that got the turnout up to sort of 10% more than many commentators thought that it would be. I think it was a bigger part of the 80-seat majority than perhaps many Conservatives actually wished to admit to themselves. And I think within the next 5 years, we are going to have a battle over membership of the ECHR, which will be almost like the Brexit debate all over again. This is going to rise to very near the top of the agenda in this country.
Because it is all about whether or not you have taken back control. It's about whether our Parliament can decide things or whether there is an overarching body that will tell us to do something different. And that these international commitments were taken on under very different circumstances, and when we agreed to them, they didn't mean what they're now interpreted.
No, I mean, the ECHR was conceived when Germany had to be held in check, you know, without putting too fine a point on it. And I find it remarkable the EU were criticising the United Kingdom today over our suggestion that we might derogate to some extent from the convention, when actually the convention was put in place to make sure we didn't have another war in Europe.
Well, and the European Union will not sign up to the European Convention.
And they're not members themselves.
Because the European Court of Justice will not allow a superior court to overrule its judgments. And I can't think why we should be in a different position. Why should our courts be subsidiary to the European?
It's completely wrong. And, you know, there are a couple of international treaties which I think are worth mentioning in addition to the ECHR. The first is obviously the Good Friday Agreement, which requires that we remain members of the convention. And that's going to be quite a difficult one to get round. But of course, as we all know, the three of us know, the Good Friday Agreement has been observed in the breach most recently by the way that the protocol in now the Windsor Framework, which is Protocol Mark II, has been forced on Northern Ireland. And I think we need to take a really good hard look at the Good Friday Agreement if we're going to get away from the ECHR. And then the other agreement, I'm afraid, is the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, because it reiterates our commitment to the ECHR. I can't remember the exact page. I know you're very good on page numbers, Jacob. But, you know, there's a direct and declaration that we are going to, you know, stay with the ECHR.
And devolution with Scotland, with Wales. I mean, Blair was absolutely determined to Europeanise us as much as he possibly could. And one of the arguments, Jacob, against leaving ECHR is the sheer level of disruption that it would cause with all of these different agreements. But that's not an argument for not doing the right thing.
Absolutely. But the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, is a real point, isn't it? Because that will be problematic for those of us who are unionists, who don't want to do anything that risks the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is an argument that says if you leave the ECHR, you put yourself in the position of Belarus and Russia. Why would you do that?
But that's nonsense, isn't it?
Well, of course, I mean, Jacob made the point earlier that, this was all signed up to in 1951, devised in the late 1940s, in a very different world, for very different reasons. And actually, through judicial activism, the ECHR has crept into areas of our life that it was never intended
Making law. Not adjudicating law, but making law on the hoof.
And we've been the first country to leave the European Union. It shows that we do actually, when really push comes to shove on big issues. I think it's very interesting. I think this country tends to get little issues always wrong, but on the really big issues, I think we do in the end tend to get it right. Jacob, I feel this. I sense you do as well. I think the Conservatives, with this legislation, will not succeed. I think our judiciary and those in Strasbourg will make sure of that. But I think we'll go into the next election with the Conservative Party, probably against its will, and probably not being sincere, which applied to Brexit in some ways.
Some of us were sincere.
Well, no, I know that. I know
there's a sense of déjà vu here.
But there is. It's a very similar. It's a very similar issue, and I think the Conservatives will go into the next election saying, "Look, we tried and tried and tried. We accept we failed, not through want of trying." But a big pledge will get made. A big pledge of some kind will get made in the next manifesto.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right, that it is last chance saloon for the ACHR. If they try and stop us dealing with small boats, then the majority in this country to leave will be unstoppable.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Very much. We look forward to seeing you again soon, but don't forget, as always, to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, the blundering Bank of England has bungled its words once again in the latest in its saga of the pitiful blame game. Find out what one of its economists said after these messages from our sponsors.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Saturday nights on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
Saturday nights on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Stephen says, "Hi Jacob, I hope you gave Mick a good tip. Taxi drivers deserve a reward for good service." And Alan says, and Alan's absolutely spot on, the Lords will do all they can to block the new bill, so good luck with that one. And Peter says, "It's a start, but doesn't go far enough. We need to repeal the HRA and step away from the UN Refugee Convention and the Geneva Convention, amend the Immigration Act and step away from the ECHR and ignore all its rulings." Well, Peter, you're quite bold, but I'm not sure you're wrong. I think we should be looking at your suggestions. But let's move on to the Bank of England, because its chief economist, Hugh Pill, told a US podcast that there is a reluctance to accept that, yes, we're all worse off. I mean, if that isn't managing decline, I don't know what is. He continued to say that the refusal to take our share was exacerbating inflation, citing demand for higher pay and business price rises as sources for further price increases. But the bank's job is to keep inflation at its target rate of 2%. In the year to March, it was 5 times above that target. Now, I went earlier today to a brilliant presentation by Politeia, where Tim Congdon, who is the doyen of monetarist economists in this country, raised the question, the Monetary Policy Committee unanimous in error. He pointed the finger of blame firmly at the Bank of England. It has failed in its one task of keeping inflation low and is now blaming all of us. But I've got my brilliant panel made up of the pugnacious former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the co-founder of Novara Media, Aaron Bastani. Aaron, can you defend the Bank of England, or has it just bungled?
Well, it's one of those issues where I suspect the three of us would agree that this is absolutely outrageous. Nobody wants high inflation. But for somebody of that seniority in a national, in a central bank, which is what the Bank of England is, to say that, look, you need to get poorer, is astonishing. And the subtext to all of this has been over the last 6 months, you aren't getting poorer quickly enough. We have high inflation, but you need to get even poorer, even more quickly, so we can get it under control. And that's been the whole vibe around wage restraint. Now, we probably do disagree about the wage restraint bit. But yeah, the fact that he can say this overtly, I just find astonishing, frankly. And I think it really speaks to the fact that institutions in this country, economic, political, and indeed cultural, broadly feel that they're insulated from public accountability and scrutiny. We can just say these outlandish things, which everybody disagrees with, but there'll be no consequences.
But isn't this, Kelvin, the problem? That we've thought now for some years that politicians can't be relied upon to make decisions. So we'll give them to clever people who will be able to work it out, devoid of the grubby business of politics. And then they turned out to be insufferably arrogant and think we should get poorer.
Well, hold on a second. Look, we are going to get poorer, and we probably have to be poorer. We spent 18 months sitting on our rear ends with the government funding a lack of production. We called it a lockdown. It was a complete disaster. That cost us billions we don't have. Secondly, along comes Mr. Putin, and up go energy prices by 400%. Then we have inflation. And then at the same time, we were ladling on. The Bank of England was pouring out monetarism at 100 miles an hour. We were going to have a disaster. And we've had the disaster, and we're going to have to go through pain. There is, whether the pain, if you were a monetarist, for instance, you would have not been throwing. So if you don't do that, if you don't throw money at everything, right, then we stood a very good chance of controlling it earlier. The pain would have been a lot worse. We are in a situation now where we have a quasi-recession, but what we don't have is we don't have unemployment. So although there is poverty, and people are poorer, they're not as poor as if we had this 40 years ago.
But it's the Bank of England who poured this money on and kept on pouring it on.
Absolutely. and didn't deal with the way the Americans dealt with it. We said, we have a problem, we have to try and stop this inflation. What we're going to do is we're going to jack up interest rates. Now, so I agree with you, but I don't agree with the sense that somebody shouldn't actually say what the truth is. The truth is, whether you're a billionaire, yeah, you can take a bit of poverty, right? And if you're at the bottom of the line, it's tough. But actually, universal credit was raised, wasn't it, by 10%, right? Yeah. So, and actually, there is money, £370, I think, going out in 3
Minimum
tranches.
wage went up by 10% as well, yeah.
So they are making the effort to make sure. But overall, our country is poorer and our people are poorer. And I don't see how that can be addressed until we get inflation under control. They have done a bad job. That guy who's the Bank of England governor, shocking. His previous job of the Financial Conduct Authority, terrible. Well, so he is a poor guy to run this country. But to say that, oh, you can carry on being wealthy, carry on having 20% pay hikes and all the rest of it is not a goer.
One of the things Tim Congdon said in his speech today was that the Bank of England governor should be held to account, and the chairman of the MPC say that if they fail to meet the 2% target by a long way, then actually their jobs should be at risk. Because currently, if you're the governor of the Bank of England, you're there for 8 years, nothing can remove you, and it doesn't matter how bad you are at the job. Can that be right, to have unaccountable people making such important decisions?
No, it's a gravy train. And, you know, your party... I'm not attacking you, Jacob, so don't worry, but your party came in 2010, the Conservatives, albeit in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and said, we'll have a bonfire of the Quangos. And to me, this is everything that's wrong right now with contemporary British politics. We have somebody who's unelected who decides... You know, the base rate of interest, that's what the Bank of England does on a regular basis, and they're paid a great deal of money for it. And if this set of powers was with elected politicians, as it used to be, then they say something daft like this and they don't meet their targets, they get the boot from the electorate. Now, you might say, well, they're saying the right thing and it might be unpopular. That's how it works in a democracy. I do find it extraordinary that somebody like Andrew Bailey on about £450,000 a year, before pensions, before all the rest of it, can basically not do his job. It's like a CEO overseeing a failing company, and there's no comeuppance for it.
And don't you think that actually the politicians are held responsible anyway, because people whose prices have gone up and whose income hasn't aren't sitting there saying it's Andrew Bailey. They're saying it's the government.
But isn't the truth about the matter?
Can I just because I want to come to you.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's one of those things which, look, everybody in politics over the last 25 years has agreed that, yes, of course, central bank, having independence, isn't it fantastic, isn't it wonderful? I think if inflation stays really high, let's say above 6-7% into the beginning of next year, I do think there needs to be a conversation about, well, actually, is this a smart way to run the economy? Because if we have, say, the base rate of interest beginning of next year, because, look, they're going to keep on increasing it until we get inflation down, that's what they're meant to do anyway, we could be looking at something like 6-7% base rate of interest. And for people saying, well, it was so much higher in the early 1990s, well, people are so much more leveraged on debt because house prices are so much higher. So it's going to feel like the early 1990s, and that will harm politicians, you're right.
On the early 1990s, Kelvin, you believed in accountability. You read for The Sun. What did you say to John Major after we left the exchange rate mechanism and he rang you up?
Well, do you know what's bizarre? What used to happen, it doesn't happen now, but that's because the circulation was 4 million a day and it was considered powerful, The Sun. On the day that the interest rates literally went up from, say, 4 or 5% up to 15%, right, he called me up and he said... and he fought it. He fought it, actually, completely wrongly, took on the market and he lost. He rang up and said, why would you call the editor of The Sun up about this? Anyway, he called me up and he simply said, tell me, how's it all going to play tomorrow, Kelvin? What are you going to do? I said, well, I've got a bucket on my desk, Prime Minister, and I'm going to pour it all over you. And he paused for a second and said, oh, you are a wag. Right. But, look, this wouldn't happen today, first of all, because The Sun only sells about 4 copies a day, so that's the end of that. And people only pay issue because of Rupert Murdoch owning it. But it is an important moment. I love the idea of the Bank of England government being called to say, well, this is what your job is. What have you done? Isn't the truth about the matter is that actually the Bank of England governor isn't independent and can't possibly be, and he has on the phone Jeremy Hunt or whoever preceded him saying, honestly, we can't take any more of this heat. I'm afraid you're going to have to calm this down. And isn't he a politician, really?
Well, the Bank of England's only independent because an Act of Parliament says so, and Acts of Parliament can always be changed. But I think, Kelvin, you've got your bucket ready for the Governor of the Bank of England. And in private conversation, Kelvin's been willing to say what's in that bucket, but he's too polite to say it in family viewing time. Thank you very much to my panel. They'll be sticking around, so I'm sure you will too. Coming up next, whose side are the police on? The eco-zealots or the motorists going to work? My panel and I will be getting in to how we get a handle on this next.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
Right, folks, that was a spicy one, wasn't it?
With us four, plus a special guest.
Sometimes she has to stick her foot in it. Sometimes she has to say things as they are.
Sometimes I think we should keep the refugees and send the pensioners to Rwanda. Then we'd be in a much better state.
Well, Benjamin, that is...
The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Jay says, most of us accepted we were poor about 12 months ago. The Bank of England needs to keep up. It's where we go next which is most concerning. I can only imagine we'll have to accept once again that we will be even poorer than the poorer we were before. That's very good, complicated, but very good. Christine says, these idiots at the Bank of England really make me sick. They're paid whopping salaries and can't do their job. If they were in the private sector, they would be out on their ear. And of course, the Bank of England was private until nationalised by the Labour government in the 1940s. And Nicola says, that's very kind, hi Jacob, I love your posh accent, thank you for that, and sometimes archaic terminology. And I love it especially when you come out with bits of Latin. I didn't know much Latin before, but I now know more. Vox populi, vox dei. My dear late mum also found it sweet when you took your smart little lad out canvassing with you. Well, he's quite big now. I'm so pleased that you seem to get on well with Nigel and that you're talking to Ben Habib. So thank you for these very kind male mogs. Keep them coming. Now, the question is, whose side is the police on? Why do they seem to treat eco-warriors with kid gloves whilst hammering motorists who just want to get to work? The question arises as disruptive eco-warriors have caused more public frustration this week after protesters irritated drivers by slow walking in front of busy central London traffic, with one such individual stepping out of his vehicle to try and move the activist out of the way. However, the motorist received a warning from the police that if he were to attempt to remove the protesters, this would be treated as assault. So how far should the police go to prevent this disruption? And are such actions needed to stop hindrance to hard-working citizens up and down the country? And should the police actually be a bit more sympathetic when those of us trying to get about our ordinary lawful business may be pushing at the edges? Kelvin, do you get the feeling sometimes that the police aren't on our side?
I think it's quite shocking what's going on right now. So I admire the fact that in the last 3 years we've now got more police officers than we've ever had before. The question is, whose side are the police on in these difficult areas? I recognise that if you're a lowly copper, it's not you that's making these decisions. But what would be wrong with saying to those people, by the way, protest alongside the pavement, but do allow the traffic to flow through? But they won't do that. What they do is they are actually looking out to see whether a motorist loses his or her temper, and at that point say to them, one more time, matey, and you're arrested. And yet these people, I mean, this wasn't just one road, you know, in London. There were about 7 roads. And these people are thinking about it. They're choosing the main highways to disrupt you. And yet you, who are sitting there, you should have been at this meeting, you should have been at that hospital, you should have been on that building site. Actually, nobody gives a toss about you. But what they do care about is if you tear down some kind of poster or something. So what has to be done? I think we need political leadership. Why can't Rishi say, just simply call in the Metropolitan Commissioner? He gets called in about everything else. Why not call him about that and say, this is not acceptable? And the Metropolitan Commission will say, well, the law says this. And if that is the answer, and it may well be the answer, then you say, the time has come. We have got to change the balance of power on the streets. It is not reasonable that people can disrupt your life, and yet if you try to correct it, you are the person that gets arrested. It is not reasonable.
Aaron, I'm very torn about this because I strongly believe in the right to protest as being part of our democratic right. But obstructing the King's Highway is also something that you're not allowed to do. So how can you allow legitimate protest without breaking other laws?
Well, first, it's important to say, I mean, I disagree with a few things Kelvin said there. A police officer is right to say to a citizen that you shouldn't commit assault, and they potentially would be committing assault. And I don't know if the officer said to that particular gentleman, you will be arrested if you continue to do...
But shouldn't the policeman be saying, come on, you've got to get out of the middle of the road because you're obstructing the King's Highway? Yeah. And the police are deciding to enforce one law but not the other.
Well, I think, look, you're a police officer, and one of the first things you have to do is obviously maintain public order. And you don't want to breach the peace. And any protest situation in kind of in policing parlance is a public order problem, public order situation, I would call it. And the first thing you don't want to do in that context is to escalate or inflame a public order situation. And I do think, particularly right now with the way the economy is going, lots of people are very upset about a bunch of things. I think, generally speaking, the Home Office, the Metropolitan Police Service think if we can get through the next 8 months without riots, small, localised or whatever, they'll be very happy. So the idea that you start to potentially inflame even smallish protests like this, I think actually is a very prudent thing to do. And look, these people have been in the game for a century and a half. They know what they're doing. So I think there's a logic as to why they did what they did and why they're allowing these protests to happen albeit that they're infringing the law, they're obstructing a highway, but they're not particularly aggressive or violent.
There is another view, which is the one that the judge took of the Just Stop Oil protesters at Dartford Bridge, of course, in which
undermines the point they're being softly treated.
Absolutely delighted to see, which was the one got 3 years and the other one got 2 years, 7 months. Now, these people, by sitting on top of that bridge, caused 40 hours of damage, and so they threw the book at them. It's not as though they can't.
The police stopped the traffic. Yes, the police thought the poor dears might be at risk and therefore stopped the traffic. I couldn't understand why they didn't just let the traffic carry on.
I don't understand why somebody they did a banner drop. One of them, like I say, has got 3 years. One's got 2 years, 7 months. the police obstructed the traffic. So I don't understand how them causing a public nuisance gets...
Well, look,
I find that astonishing. When we've got people who've committed sexual assault, there was one young man in Scotland who was... He's 21 now. He assaulted a 13-year-old girl when he was 17. He didn't even get a custodial sentence. And then we have these two people doing a banner drop, and one of them goes to prison for 3 years. I found that outlandish.
This was a message.
Outlandish.
This was a message to these people. And I would love to see somebody who is literally blocking
But then they're not being treated softly, are they? Right. That's undermining your initial point. You're saying they're being treated with kid gloves. Evidently, they're not.
No, that particular case, they're not. I would like to see these guys...
very much a one-off, though, doesn't it?
I would like to see these guys being produced to the courts and given lengthy jail sentences. Then they can decide whether they really believe in what they're saying.
But, Aaron, I want to come to your point, because I think it's a very important one. The police want to maintain public order. And therefore they are being soft with the protesters. But then they're not enforcing the law to the benefit of the people who are being stopped in the traffic. They're just assuming that they, out of their goodwill and their good nature, won't get so frustrated that they will break the law. That seems to me to be both a risk, but also unbalanced in terms of how you implement the law.
It's a dynamic situation, isn't it? I remember policing, for instance, in response to austerity in 2010, 2011, 2012. It was very assertive, very aggressive. You know, I remember mass arrests in regards to the Olympic opening ceremony, in Tower Hamlets confronting the EDL, student protests, etc. By the way, in the majority of those cases, the police had to make payouts because they were doing illegal arrests. They weren't warranted arrests. So I think there's a double dynamic here. Firstly, they don't want to be making payouts to people, which they probably would end up doing because activists tend to know what their legal rights are and where the police have and haven't overstepped the mark. And then secondly, going back to the point I made a few moments ago, I do think because the wider political climate, there would be a concern about clamping down on protests. Now, for instance, if you had truck drivers stopping fuel distribution around the country in protest to rising energy prices, you might support that. Well, people here who don't like Just Stop Oil might support those people. Now, if those people started getting arrested for those protests, I think you probably have a rather different reaction. So,
well, hold on. Once an industrial dispute, this is a political dispute.
They're both political.
And no. One on the industrial, they say the petrol drivers, they wanted more money. These people want to actually change the way that our country is run, and they want fresh laws.
Yeah, no, it's just a fair point, though, isn't it? That if it's a protest that is on our side, we suddenly say, "Oh, that's marvellous." And if it's a protest that we don't like,
it's not a fair point, man. This is a completely different point. Yours is an industrial point. Mine is a political point. I am not in favour of people simply standing in the middle of the road.
The route was agreed, and that is something that happens regularly.
No, I appreciate that, but I'm just trying to make my point here, which is, look, I'm anti-fox hunting. You're probably pro-fox hunting. If people were doing something similar to bring back, to repeal laws which were brought about by New Labour to make fox hunting legal again, and they were blocking a road, I wouldn't want them to go to prison for multiple years because I think it's a very unwise use of taxpayers' money. It's cheaper to send somebody to Yale than to jail, and I think it's an astonishing waste of police time and of the criminal justice system. So I understand your frustration, but I think this idea of sending people to prison willy-nilly, I just don't think it's going to work because there's lots of people and they're not going anywhere.
I am massively hostile to the fact that we do not send people to jails for longer, and those people, they deserve it.
This political conversation we're going to have to draw stumps on, but thank you to my panel. Up next, a government scandal. Billions of pounds of taxpayers' money was sent in error or to fraudulent schemes during the pandemic, and it's still being swept under the carpet. I'll be talking to the very man who resigned in protest at the government's handling of this controversy.
Coming up on Dan Wootton tonight, as top Olympian Mara Yamalchi slams a trans runner for competing against women in the London Marathon, the athlete at the centre of the storm, Glenique Frank, debates the controversy with Team GB shot putter and women's rights activist Amelia Strickler. Join Dan, Angela Levin, James Daly MP and Lionel Shriver tonight 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I'm a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Hello, I'm Calvin Robinson. Do not miss my Common Sense Crusade, Saturdays at 7 p.m. Join me for some in-depth discussions on faith. Is that not the start of the slippery slope? It's very much so. And the big moral questions of the day. I'm baffled.
You've got some nerve.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is still State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Alan says, off point, any protester in receipt of benefits should have them stopped. Barry says, as I was instructed when at police college in the mid-1960s, in pursuing our duty, we should act without fear or favour. The politicians should steer away from daily interference with the police enforcing the laws of our country, regardless of being challenged by protesters. And Andrew says, why do the police continually protect these lunatic movements? Andrew, I think that is the point of the day. Thank you. Now, the influential House of Commons Public Accounts Committee, and it is one of the most respected House of Commons select committees, has issued a damning report. The committee found that of £2 billion claimed illicitly during the pandemic, just £10 million had been recovered. According to the report, around £1 billion of unlawfully distributed loans have apparently just been written off by the government. The report slammed a lack of curiosity over COVID bounce-back loans made to businesses with minimal checks and a laissez-faire attitude to the distribution of the funds. I'm very pleased now to be joined by Lord Agnew, who was the minister in charge of tackling fraud, who resigned rather spectacularly from the government and then actually handed his portfolio over to me. Lord Agnew, you found as a minister it was very frustrating trying to stop the fraud in the first place and then get anyone to take it seriously. Why didn't the government care?
Well, it's completely perplexing to me because these are large sums of money going to bad people. It shouldn't be a political issue. It should just be common sense. And what's interesting is in the Times today, they report on the thing you've just mentioned, but 3 or 4 pages on, they talk about the rising interest debt burden of this country. And in the last year, the interest debt burden has gone up by £34 billion. And here we have, in this situation, an opportunity to recover billions of pounds that would help at least reduce the debt burden. So I'm completely flummoxed.
And when the systems were set up, there was a desire to get money out of the door as quickly as possible. And there seemed to be no pause for thought to see if the applications were fraudulent or were well-founded.
That's correct. I mean, it's almost exactly 3 years ago that the scheme was launched, the Bounce Back Loan Scheme. And at the time, I had very, very terse discussions with officials and indeed ministers to implore them to put tests, to put checks in before the money went out of the door, and they were all brushed aside.
And that's the really puzzling thing. But why at that point did people not want to listen to you? That you were only talking about checks that were taking potentially 24 hours. It wasn't going to bung up the whole system.
I think they simply didn't understand that that's really all it needed. A cheque that would have delayed the process, not even a day actually, would have saved a great deal of money, but the message simply didn't get through.
Because money was going to companies that had only just been set up or companies that had never done any business, and they were just sucking funds from the state without any proper checks.
Correct. I mean, there were 1,500 companies that received the money that didn't exist when the COVID epidemic actually occurred. So they literally received the money for doing nothing.
And that check could have been done in about 30 seconds, getting in touch with Companies House.
Correct, because in those situations, all they had to do was actually check when the company started trading, which they didn't even bother to do.
And we tried, you were very helpful to me, to get a dashboard of the banks with the worst fraud levels and the worst bad loan levels. We found this was very strongly opposed, which I couldn't understand. Some banks done quite well, some banks done appallingly. Again, why do you think there was such opposition to making this information public so people could judge for themselves?
Well, I think it simply shines a light on the whole inadequacy of the scheme, which is why they don't want people to see it. But it was down to your persistence that we got the dashboard, and it was published again a couple of months ago in February, and I still hope that will continue, because every time it happens, it reinforces the argument, and hopefully one day a minister somewhere will wake up and put 2 and 2 together that there is a lot of money going begging.
Indeed, and that's what's so puzzling about it, that, as you say, this is sort of free money for a government which has highest tax level in 70 years, expenditure that is running at levels that we haven't historically seen. It needs to get cash back, and yet on this particular issue, because it's embarrassed by the policy failures of 3 years ago, or because the money's been spent and it just doesn't care, it's not looking after it.
It's probably a combination of those two things. And it's important to remember it was a very big scheme. It was £47 billion that was thrown out of the door. And you know, most of it was for a good reason, but there's a very high percentage that went to the wrong people, and we could still get it back if the will was there.
And you've absolutely highlighted this. I mean, your resignation, you put down your folder in the House of Lords and said, I'd had enough, I'm off. In my view, that actually made people focus on this in a way that they hadn't before. So I hope you feel you can take some credit for getting some interest attached to this subject.
Well, I think I was fortunate that you took over the brief after I left, and you kept the flag flying, and you pushed through the creation of the Public Sector Fraud Authority, which is a bit more that is now available, but it still needs some ministerial oversight and just some challenge to those banks who received that money. And let's remember that a lot of bank loans were paid back by this money because it was free, the interest rate was zero for the first year. So the banks did extremely well out of it as well.
Yes, the banks were able to shift their risk profile, weren't they, from loans to businesses to loans that were fully backed by the government and the interest rate paid by a year. So they, of course, wanted to do this.
Exactly. So they have an obligation, in my view, to work harder at this, because it was a huge saving to them. They managed to get rid of probably a lot of doubtful debts that could have gone bad and put those through the scheme, which was a huge saving to them. So, yes.
Do you think in hindsight that the scheme was overall justified, or do you think that looking at it, it should have been done very differently and much more tightly?
Well, I mean, I don't believe in hindsight, really, because it doesn't correct the situation. I mean, there was a parallel scheme called C-bills, where in that situation, 20% of the risks remain with the banks, and the losses on that for fraud have been far, far lower because self-interest prevails. And so, theoretically, that's what they should have done. At the time, we were told the banks wouldn't participate because they couldn't move quickly enough. I think if they just put the fraud checks in at the beginning and pursued it more aggressively since then, we would be in a lot better position.
Well, I think capitalism works with shared risk. Lord Agnew, thank you very much. That's all from me. Up next, it's the acclaimed Dan Wootton. Mr. Wootton, what's in your box of tricks this evening?
Jacob, great show. We've got a fascinating debate coming up. Actually, you may have seen this person, Glenique Frank, caused a lot of controversy. Trans woman running the London Marathon this weekend, went on the BBC, boasted about the appearance that's caused uproar in female sports. So Amelia Strickler, Britain's shot put champion, member of Team GB, is going to go head-to-head with Glenique on the show tonight.
Well, that sounds extremely exciting. I hope you don't get fisticuffs with your athletes. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and you now want to hear about the weather in Somerset.
Good evening. This is Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. It is going to turn warmer over the next few days, leading into a mixed picture for the long weekend. There will be some sunshine, but there'll also be some heavy showers. Could well be some heavy rain tomorrow from this little weather system pushing up from the southwest. Ahead of it, we've got another weather front bringing increasing cloud and maybe a little rain to the north coast of Northern Ireland and the west coast of Scotland by morning. Bit of drizzle in the southwest, the odd shower elsewhere, but for most it's a dry night. Clearer spells across the heart of the country will allow it to turn quite chilly. The coldest conditions in northern Scotland, where a frost is again likely. Elsewhere will be down into single digits. So chilly start to Thursday, but we should see some brighter skies compared to today over North Wales and northern England, at least for a time, but generally clouding over again. Wet weather across Scotland with snow on the hills, although the central belt will probably turn drier later. And then this next weather system I talked about earlier, spreading some outbreaks of rain into parts of England and Wales. A little bit milder, but obviously it won't feel all that mild with the rain and the increasing winds. And we'll see that rain becoming more extensive through the evening. Some uncertainty about how far north it gets and how heavy it is, but many places likely to see some rain during Thursday night and as we head into Friday. You can see here actually a swirl. It's an area of low pressure that's going to edge away during Friday and take the rain with it. So yes, a damp start for many, but certainly in the west likely to brighten up on Friday with some sunny spells. Eastern areas may stay a bit glum, but it will generally turn drier. Still pretty cold in northern Scotland, but elsewhere temperatures just on the rise. And look at this in the south, 16, 17, 18, maybe even a little higher, where we see some lengthy spells of sunshine. A mixed bag into the weekend, drier on Saturday initially, but then some heavy showers develop.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I